How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, today we're going to do an episode on build systems that expect mistakes, not perfection. Now, that sounds counterintuitive, right? We're working in corrections. Are you telling me, Gangi, that we're not supposed to be perfect? So me and Russ did a great dialogue yesterday on policy development and basically what goes into the creation of a policy or what should go into a creation of a policy. We did it more from an administrative perspective, but we added the input of frontline staff as well. And we came up with 20 tips that relate to what should go into the development of a policy. It was a great dialogue, ran about a little over an hour, but definitely something worth checking out. Now, with that said, there were some other areas that I thought were interesting that we didn't get a chance to explore. And this is one of them. Basically, policies have to prepare for human error, because we are dealing with human error. Now, one of my books I've written out on the market before talks about corrections as a layered process. And we kind of explore the fact that we are defined by failsafes. Now, with that said, I thought we can kind of continue that dialogue from yesterday by utilizing that thought and how do we implement that into our policies. So basically exactly what this says, build systems that expect mistakes, not perfection. And this is a dialogue that we really haven't discussed at this level before. So I think it's going to be an interesting dialogue. I'm going to read from a passage from my book that's coming out probably within a couple of days on ebook. It's called Warden's Wisdom. And this is passage 76. There'll be 100 passages. It's a pretty big book, guys. It's probably over 700 pages. And it's going to be available as an ebook right off the bat. So you're going to be able to get that right on Amazon. And then later on, it's going to get published as a soft cover book, but it'll be $9.99 on the ebook, but it's going to probably cost a little bit more when you get that soft cover version because it's a bit bigger. And I'm excited to get that out. Now, guys, if you have interest in the meantime, I have other books on the market, but I released 2 other ebooks that also in a couple of months from now will also be available soft cover through the publisher. And we have Surviving Without a Mentor. That's 100 deep cut tips for rookie correctional staff. So basically, coming into the profession, not having a mentor. We know that's happening. And this book, Ranked Before Ready. 100 Subtle Survival Tips for New Correctional Supervisors. And this will be the book that's coming out within a couple of days, 100 Subtle Lessons in Prison Leadership. I had to make some changes. So I had to pull it back and then reintroduce it. And guys, don't forget I have other books on the market as well. I have books on Amazon, Correctional, Breaking Boundaries and Inmate Manipulation Decoded. And then I also have, again, 6 books already on Blue 360 Media, not counting these ebooks, and one that just came out on March 30th for our rookies. I'm actually waiting to get the copy of those books myself, but I know that the copies are out because people have ordered them, already received the copies. I, as the author, have not got my copies, which is very unique. Let me get Joe. What up, Joe?
Hey, morning, brother. What's happening?
Good, Joe. Hey, Joe, you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Joe Pomponio. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Texas Department of Corrections, 29 years and 6 months. Currently working as an assistant jail administrator in our local sheriff's department in the jail division and a panel member here for Tier Talk.
Love having you, Joe. Now, Joe, this is a pretty unique topic because I think people expect policies to be perfect and they write them as if we can control every situation, every variable that's going to come in real time. So I think that some of the policies that we create have to prepare for human error. And that's where we develop fail safes. But it's funny because a lot of people, man, they will push that they got the perfect policy. But people that have been in prison management long enough knows there's no policy that's perfect because you can't account for situations and human error. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah. You know, when policies are created, you know, they're created with good intent and pretty good forethought. But, you know, a lot of times policies are derived from situations that happened in the past. And sometimes we're so focused on that situation that happened where we're devising this policy, we're not thinking in the future and taking, you know, into account any other external variables that can, you know, come along later on down the road.
So true. So I thought what we would do is I have this, I'm going to read from the passage, but I have it broken out. All these passages are going to be broken down to many sections because the thought is an evolving thought. And I thought we could kind of break it down piece by piece. So, okay. So again, the title of this passage is going to be passage 76 in this book. And it's called Build Systems That Expect Mistakes, Not Perfections. Now, guys, this does partner well with the show I did yesterday with Russ, but I thought we could just add to this. So first part of the passage, Joe. Corrections is often described as a tight ship, a place of structure, control, and precise order. And while discipline and accountability are essential, it's dangerous to believe that precision equals perfection. It doesn't, and it never has. Correctional facilities are staffed by human beings, fallible, exhausted, overtasked, emotionally affected human beings. And when administration designs systems as if mistakes are unacceptable or worse, impossible, they build a culture that shames error, hides failures, and leaves no room for real growth or recovery. In reality, corrections is a layered system, a system with redundancies, backups, cross-checks, and safeguards, not because we distrust our people, but because we trust the environment to test them. We expect challenges, we expect fatigue, we expect judgment calls to sometimes miss the mark. That's why the system exists, not to demand perfection, but to protect the mission when imperfection shows. That's key. I just want to mention that. This is for our administrators or whatever, our leadership that leads by fear. Remember this. I know sometimes people weaponize policy, like that's their go-to. Someone messes up and you use that policy because that's your crutch. But listen to what this just said. That's why the system exists, not to demand perfection, but to protect the mission when imperfection shows up. Now, if you're building or leading a facility where even small mistakes are treated like betrayal, you're not building excellence, you're building fear. And fearful operations don't last, they fracture. Joe, what's your thoughts on that first part?
Well, when a lot of people, which is correct, a lot of people use policies as a crutch. Usually their actions are derived from a policy that's already written. And, they always use that as their fallback. Policies are there to safeguard, the system, the people, the place, the individuals, the process. But, there's a lot of variables that happen that take place in corrections that nobody can really account for until it actually happens. And when you're creating policy, it's always a good thing to have a collective information gathering from other people, because sometimes other people can kind of give you the foresight of things that may happen. We use the policies as a something that's written in stone, something that's been there through the test of time, has proven that it's worked. So it's something that we always use as our go-to, and we get so wrapped up in that go-to that sometimes we don't think about the external variables or the redundancies that could happen later on down the road that, we didn't account for initially. There's always going to be something that comes up within a policy that's not covered. Like in Texas, we have the use of force plan. And within the use of force plan, there's 3 or 4 more policies that it kind of reverts itself to. Use of chemical agents, use of restraints. There's a whole plethora that of different policies that it reverts to, and sometimes we get so wrapped up in that one policy that we forget about some of the others. And it's easy to do and hard to configure.
Yeah, and guys, when I wrote the prior leadership book, I think it's Unlocking Your Leadership Potentials, where I introduced the thought of a layered process. And what I want to mention here too, kind of related to that, but also to this passage is, and I think I actually have it earlier in this book as well, is when you have those fail safes in place, if you have a concern that breaks through all the layers, you've identified a systematic concern, not more of an individualized concern, because that's why you have the different layers also in how you address it. If I got a concern that's broken at one layer, maybe it's an individual concern, maybe it's something that could be situational, but it's really not systematic. It's just, maybe a workaround we couldn't figure out in the moment. But when you have something that breaks through multiple layers, now you have a systematic concern. One of the biggest examples I use, and I think I use it in the book, maybe even here too, is you get an inmate that's caught out of bounds. An inmate that's caught out of bounds, a lot of people think, well, they'll just write the charge. It's a simple out of bounds. So let's say an inmate's supposed to be in the unit and they wind up in the infirmary, or they wind up in a program they're not supposed to be in. So now, I'll just give the inmate a simple out of bounds and be done with it. Well, no, because there's a systematic failure. Look at how many areas this inmate had to pass to get to an area that they're not supposed to be in. Look at all the checks and balances. So that's not an error of just the unit officer. That's an error of, going through whatever they got to go through, yard, some type of checkpoint, some type of another check-in at the receiving area. And now all of a sudden we broke through every layer. And sometimes that could also be a test. The inmate could be testing it. If I can make it here and they're not doing their due diligence here, maybe I'll try for something next time. So I think what's good about having that understanding of policy and knowing that we are protected through layer fail-safes, you can also identify, wow, we broke through every layer here on this one. That's a concern. And one of the things that stood out to me on this when I was writing it was I mentioned situational variables. When people come up with policies and procedures, they may not always take into account situational variables. They may just throw things down into what they feel is a perfect world, and it's not. And what people have to realize are that these situational challenges, or I would say environmental challenges, sorry about that, these situational variables or these environmental challenges are like testing our individuals in real time. That's why we need those fail-safes, because when you're trying to figure out these nuanced situations and they're coming your way, right now we're creating a book. We haven't written it yet. So now you got to realize that at one point, people are going to make different decisions. So you're hoping that the fail-safe somehow has a foundational application. And I think that matters too, where you can have in the real moment a lot of different concerns coming your way, but you're hoping that one of the fail-safes have a more generalized approach, that it takes a little bit more of control over the situation. So again, those that are immediately affected by it, that's where it's happening in real time. But eventually, as it layers up, you got a stronger foundation to just go ahead and slow things down. Does that make sense, Joe?
Yeah, and one thing I always kind of leaned to as a supervisor was running drills, because running drills, we found that after the drill was complete, there were things that came up that we didn't account for in policies. So, I always ran, whether it be a fire drill, an escape drill, a hostage drill, just different, drills in different areas, and when it all played out, when we debriefed about it, we found that there were topics, there were variables that showed up in these things that we hadn't accounted for in policy in 15, 20 years.
Sorry, bro. That thought went by pretty quick. All right. So, right. And guys, so again, guys, this is just letting people know that we are human. So now the next part I got, Joe, and I think you'll find this interesting, is, let me get rid of this part. Now we have the next part. The myth of the flawless officer, because there are many times, guys, where people that create policy actually become very dependent on the officer that's working there. Now, when I say dependent, I don't even mean by position. I mean by name. I mean, we could do this, and I'm sure Joe works there 5 days a week. He can handle it. And you don't want to develop policy to that level of understanding your person, not the people, but your person, because at the end of the day, Joe may not be there. That's the key. So you want to develop policies, again, knowing that you don't have perfect officers. So the myth of the flawless officer. And by the way, I will say one thing before I get into this part. That's why sometimes you get supervisors that are so quick when they see a concern with policy and the way officer handled, they're so quick to come out against the officer because they do want that perfection. And it's like, that's an impossible standard, especially during these situations. That's why you got to talk to the officer and try to find out what happened. So the myth of the flawless officer. Somewhere along the line, an unhealthy narrative crept in corrections that the best officers never make mistakes, that every decision should be textbook, that once trained, a staff member should be immune to error. That belief is as unrealistic as it is dangerous. No one performs perfectly under stress every time. No one sees every angle of the situation while it's unfolding. That's key. No one, regardless of rank, gets it right 100% of the time. Even with experience, even with training, people miss things. They misjudge tone. They move too fast or too slow. They get distracted. They feel pressure and act on instinct. Expecting flawlessness is a setup for punishment, not for performance. When the standard becomes perfection, any mistake, no matter how small, becomes a moral failure. And when staff feel like they can't admit mistakes without consequence, they stop admitting them at all. Joe, have you ever worked with people that believe that the officers should be flawless?
Absolutely. And it's a very unrealistic expectation of a supervisor for their staff or for an administration for a supervisor, because at the end of the day, we're all human. There's not going to be any situation, there's not going to be any one set individual that is without flaws. Every situation is going to have something that comes up that either should have been done and wasn't done, or could have been done and wasn't done. It's an unrealistic expectation to have that demand of perfection amongst your staff, because when it's said and done, the mistakes that we make are what gives the individual their experience. You tell them about the flaw, the failure, the mistake, and that's what they learn from. That's where experience comes from. But to have this demand of perfection every time, it's totally unrealistic. It puts undue pressure on the people. It creates an unrealistic expectation for them. It's just an unrealistic demand.
Yeah, and I want to add something on that too. Guys, you ever notice, you may find this a bit interesting, that we give more forgiveness to ourselves when we make a mistake than we do to others, because we know more about the situations that made that mistake. And it's actually it stops us from falling into depression, by the way, too. So like if I make a mistake, I'm very aware of the situations and I'm able to blame the situation for that mistake. But when we look at it, when we look at someone else who makes a mistake, well, that's more the person, because we may not be aware of the situations they were dealing. So we're quick to blame the person as if it's a character flaw. And I find that there's a lot of management that does do that. Unfortunately, they'll be more forgiving for themselves and kind of, well, it happens. But we're not giving the same staff that type of forgiveness. That's why we have to ask them, what happened? Why'd you think this way? And really get a chance to understand the situation they were facing through their perspective. All because you think you may know the job does not mean that you know how they would react to it. So you could be an expert all you want, but as me and Joe discussed in the past, that doesn't mean that you're an expert on that person. Would you agree with that, Joe? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's to have that kind of demand out of people, and I've seen it time and time again. I've seen, a group of cadets that come out of the academy, come off of on-the-job training, and been on their position for 2 weeks, and they run a drill, and there's some things that they didn't do, and the supervisors were mad, and I'm like, I discussed it with them. I said, "What are you upset about? This guy's, been here at the unit, for 2 weeks, barely knows the layout of the facility, barely knows the inmate, barely knows the staff. To have that kind of demand out of somebody, especially somebody new, is unrealistic. That's why, when it comes to certain situations, training and drills are key, because, again, that's what gives the person the experience. They know what they did wrong, and that's what they learn from and drive on with. So they know the next time this is what's supposed to happen. So you can't demand perfection out of an individual at the onset, and sometimes, if you're not training your staff correctly, if you're not giving them the knowledge and the tools to enforce the policy, and sometimes you get your vets that don't even know what the hell to do. So, that's something that you got to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Joe, that is spot on. That's why training does matter, because training also allows us to get an understanding of where those fail-safes are needed. That's why even when you roll out policy, you got to give it time to run its course and see, where you have to develop those fail-safes. You also involve staff that are affected by that change to see where they may think that you need to involve fail-safes, because they'll tell you what will work and what won't work. And they also know their people.
Well, and sometimes it's not just your direct staff. It can involve other departments. If you're running a drill in medical, if you're running a drill in chaplaincy, if you're running, it can involve other departments. And sometimes running these drills in other departments is a good thing, because, it gives the other departments a good look, and, it kind of tells them, hey, we never thought about this, and this is something that we need to think about in the future.
Yep, well said. And guys, that's why we all have to be involved in those policy development. And what we always tell you guys, you can't get buy-in during implementation. Buy-in is done when you're trying to create it, when you get people involved, invested. All right, so the next thought I got, Joe, is systems should catch errors, not just people. So administrators have a responsibility to design operations that are resilient, not brittle. That means building in layers of accountability, cross-verification, and procedural flow that allows for one person to falter without the entire system failing. Some examples of layered structure include dual sign-offs for critical actions like use of force reviews or security checks, post orders that include verification steps, so logbook entries reviewed at each shift exchange, team-based incident reviews rather than single-point reports, and checklists for high-risk procedures like count, transports, and suicide watches. Redundancy and supervision where lieutenants check sergeants' activity, captains review reports, and administrators audit operations. These aren't signs of distrust. They're acknowledgments of reality. They're leadership tools. They say, we value your work so much, we built a system to support you even when you miss something. And I think the key here with this, too, I just want to mention is routine. You know, we develop things, policy, procedure that becomes routine, and sometimes routine can make us fall into complacency. So it's good to have those redundancies. Again, I like each one checking up on the next. And it's great because the first thing we lose are basics. So it's good to know that the basics are being reinforced each level up. So the basics of the officers being reinforced by the sergeant, the basics of the sergeants being reinforced by the lieutenant, all the way up the chain of the command until you have the basics of the facility, technically, through that filter, is being monitored through prison administration or jail administration. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, I totally agree. There shouldn't be one person that's left, left to catch all these errors, because, at some point you're going to become complacent looking at these forms, looking at these checklists, looking at you see so much of this on a daily basis that, it's easy to become complacent and just sign off on it and go on. I totally agree that there should be a layered process, and everything that my sergeants did, I afforded them the opportunity to do first. And then, when they thought they had a complete process or, the forms were complete, they would bring them to me for review. And, sometimes they were in good shape, and sometimes there were things that, they didn't catch. So it definitely should not be left when you're creating something. You should not leave it to one person to catch all the mistakes. A fresh pair of eyes is always a good thing.
Well said. Now, guys, as mentioned, this part right here hit home. Human error doesn't mean negligence. The reason why I was thinking this is I worked with a lot of people that are leadership that lead by fear or try to cover their own ass. And when they see error, they're quick to write things up. And it's not really to be constructive. Rather, I got to separate myself from it as opposed to taking responsibility of your team and ultimately that level of accountability. And you see that a lot with people that are really more focused on their own vanity. And some people good leadership actually will come up and tell that administrator or that high level rank official that, hey, this wasn't negligence and you're treating it as such. This could be a teachable moment. We have to try to talk to the individual, because when you start seeing these charges coming down and you got people either trying to lead through their position, trying to lead through fear or cover their own ass, they wind up creating a culture where you expect that perfection, and then people will honestly just start hiding their mistakes. So you may think on the surface you have a good running facility, but if you lift up the rug, that's what you've caused. Now, granted, people are still accountable for hiding their own mistakes, but you still got to create a culture where that's easy to do, to go ahead and speak to people, provide feedback, or if you did make a mistake, I can go to my person because he's not going to come to me because he knows what I'm about. Now, for me, it's all about integrity and competency. I talked about that before. But human error doesn't mean negligence. So as administrators, we must learn to differentiate between human error, so a lapse in attention, timing, or judgment without malicious intent, and negligence is a disregard for known responsibilities, warnings, or procedures. And then you have the misconduct, which is a willful act that violates policy or law. So it kind of goes from lack of attention to just maybe I didn't feed too much into what was needed, or eventually you actually did something wrong, so it levels up. And then too often these are treated the same. A staff member forgets to initial a log, and it's treated like willful noncompliance. A post is delayed 5 minutes due to unexpected movement, and the tone shifts from correction to reprimand. So accountability must have context. When staff feel like any mistake will be weaponized against them, they stop asking questions, they stop reporting near misses, they start hiding what went wrong, and that's how a system breaks. Not from a single catastrophic error, but from 100 unspoken ones that no one had the courage or safety to reveal. And when you're pushing policy, especially blindly, if you're not getting feedback or anything on what's happening, then you really are not in tune with your facility, and they are not speaking to you at all. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, I agree. Not every mistake or is true negligence. They're gonna a lot of people don't understand that especially in the prison business, when dealing with inmates, it's their job to beat us and it's our job to catch them. One incident I can kind of attest to and let it use as an example is random pad searches. Inmate may make it to the living area with contraband he smuggled from the kitchen, some sort of food, and the officer, for whatever reason, didn't catch it. So I'm looking to see, was the officer doing random pad searches? Was he actually, doing actual good random pad searches, or was he not doing pad searches at all? Was it a case where, the inmate just wasn't one of the random pad searches and made it by? There's going to be factors that, where they're actually doing the job. But, we just got beat. And, when you bring it up to the officer, and the officer said, you know what, he wasn't one of my random pad searches. I was doing, every third, every second, every fourth, and he made it by me, he beat me. It doesn't necessarily mean it's an automatic negligence with blatant intent that, now if they weren't doing the pad searches at all, I can see, but there's going to be variables when we create policies that sometimes, inmates are still allowed to beat us. And it's not because the officer was negligent. It's just because the inmate was lucky.
Yeah. And guys, exactly what you're saying is spot on. I mean, a lot of these things that could be mistakes are not failures. They could be corrected. And with that said, these are good teachable moments, and we're losing out on the ability to teach. Failure or mistake. Well, we'd go failure, I guess, because some people see a mistake as failure anyways in this world. Failure and success are partnered. One failure keeps you humbled. Success keeps you motivated. So you need to find a way to partner that to keep people going through it. And once you start having a system where people are more concerned about self-preservation than doing the right thing, yes, I'm still going to hold that person accountable, because some people do have that character flaw, even in a good environment. But most of the time, if you check the environment is what's pushing people into self-preservation, usually by one leader who demands fear, unfortunately, or is more into their own selves that, they figure, well, even though at your leader, that's medical's responsibility. No, it's still yours. Oh, that's on custody. Well, you're in the position, it's still yours. I mean, sometimes you got to remind people of that,
Yeah.
So systems, now this is key, guys, systems that absorb and not collapse. So administrators must build systems that assume something will go wrong at some point. Now, granted, this is one of the thoughts that when I was working on this and really messing with the questions that I was being asked to create this narrative, this is where I feel people will probably give you a lot of kickback on, because people are trying to prevent policies as if they're perfect, because they may connect their name to that policy. They identify with the policy. So I don't want to say I'm not perfect, Gange. I want to push perfection. You can't. So administrators must build systems that assume something will go wrong at some point, not constantly, but predictably, whether it's due to fatigue, miscommunication, or timing. The best run facilities have built-in cushions that allow for mistakes without catastrophe. That's where I get the absorb from. A layered system doesn't just connect. A layered system doesn't just correct, it cushions. It ensures that when something slips, there's another layer to catch it, slow it, or minimize the damage. That might be a second set of eyes. It might be a delay built into the process. It might be a cross-functional team verifying a step before it moves forward. The strongest systems in corrections are those that recognize pressure and plan around it. So, guys, believe it or not, the strongest systems are not one that have a straight fall to cement, but one that has cushions to soften the blow. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, there's no perfect policy, never has been, never will be. There's always going to be things that they don't think about, and sometimes there are going to be things that they think about. And having a system that can kind of absorb those impacts, or leaving the opportunity for a mistake to be made, or for something that they didn't catch, is kind of a good thing, because it's kind of not a just in case of, it's a, well, let's try this and see. So you got to give it some room, to, when you're writing a policy, you got to give it some room and have that cushion or that pillow for things to happen. This way you can, in the future, it gives you something to stand on and say, okay, well, we tried this, but this keeps happening, so we need to up this to this. So, it's not a perfect system, and never will be a perfect system. And every variable that you add to a policy, there's going to be 3 more variables that come up later on down the road.
Yeah, and I, again, as mentioned before, guys, these cushions are developed when you have the right people at the table, understanding how things work in real time, and not just an assumption, and not just, well, I've worked this position before 10 years ago, and I could safely assume, no, you can't, because situations change, people change. So you really got to get the investment from the people that are living and breathing. And I also find it kind of insulting where you have the people that are doing the job right there, right next to you, but you rather go to someone else who's not doing the job now, or not doing the job here, but they claim to be the expert. I mean, if you want to have them sit down and kind of help us filter through it, I get it. But the experts really are the people going through it every day, and they should really have the primary thoughts that eventually get put into the policy. Now, I have a quick little story here, a generalized reflection when a layer failed and another should catch. So in one incident review, it was discovered that an inmate had not been properly secured in his cell following an early morning medical trip. The return had occurred during a shift change. The first officer logged the return, assuming the second officer would follow through with final checks. The sergeant, meanwhile, was tied up resolving a housing dispute in another unit and didn't confirm visual head count as quickly as usual. It wasn't until the evening count that the issue was discovered. The inmate was missing, not because he escaped, but because he had been temporarily placed in an overflow cell and never reassigned. No one had made the final update. 3 responsible staff, 3 different assumptions, 1 misstep, and a system that hadn't planned for what happens when routine is disrupted. The event was caught without harm, but it raised bigger questions. Why wasn't there a secondary confirmation step during shift change? Why didn't the post order specify a clear transfer of responsibilities during handoff? And why didn't the movement log include a status follow-up box? The incident resulted in policy changes, but more than that, it changed the mindset. We didn't just say, be more careful. We said, let's build better support. And that's the shift administrators must lead. And basically, it's from reaction to resilience. So we always talk about personal resilience. So we always talk about resilience that helps people not just bounce back, but bounce forward, because we know that people are going to make mistakes. They're going to go through situations that can be very overwhelming. So we want resilience in our individuals. We want them to either bounce back or, more importantly, bounce forward. But we also want the same for the facility. We want the facility to have a dynamic where the facility itself cannot just bounce back, but bounce forward. And I think that's what it's about here. It's not just about reaction, but resilience for the facility. That makes a lot of sense to you, Joe, right?
It does. And in situations like that, 90% of the time it's a communication issue. One didn't communicate with another. That one didn't communicate with another. 90% of those times it's a communication issue. It's not a systemic failure. It's not a It's not a policy failure. It's just the fact that, you know, the officers didn't communicate with the supervision. You know, hey, I got this guy in an overflow cell, just brought him back from medical. You know, he needs to be placed in this cell. Been running my ass off, hadn't had a chance to get to him, you know, just FYI. And, you know, the oncoming officer, you know, hey, Sarge, I got one that's still down here in overflow. I need a cell for him to put him in to be reassigned. You know, first shift didn't get a chance to put him up. You know, it was just a communication failure. And, you know, it doesn't mean that there was a policy failure. It doesn't mean it was a total disregard of policy. It was just a simple communication issue. And sometimes it's what it boils down to. It's just a simple communication issue. It's not a blatant intent to violate the policy. It's, and even on the inmate side, he wasn't trying to violate policy. He wasn't trying to escape. They put him in a cell, and, you know, and he got, you know, I don't want to say forgotten about, but, you know, things happen and things slip your mind. And, you know, it's always, you know, always enforced what they call like a pass on log. As things happen during a shift, note it down. This way, if you forget to communicate that, the officer can go to that pass on log and go, okay, you know, so-and-so had a medical issue. You know, this one's on restriction. You know, it's you know, sometimes it's not about the policy. It's about communication.
Yeah, and guys, I have another passage here that maybe we'll discuss later on, but I definitely put it in books before, but I wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit more. It would relate to this, but technically I use it as a separate thought because I thought it needed a passage on its own, but it's understanding people's impulse. So when you create a policy, we do work with a lot of people that have that impulse to save lives. And sometimes they may violate policy in an effort to do that. One example was an inmate trying to kill himself, and the officer watching the inmate do it, but can't go into the cell because it's supposed to be two people that needs to open the cell, but, you know, no one's coming. They're involved in another code, so he violates policy, opens up the cell door, and saves the inmate. Thank God the inmate, it wasn't a trick or a setup, but the officer did violate policy. So how do you go ahead and deal with that officer who violated policy but good intent? And then you have another story where there was an officer on a post, saw an officer on another post getting assaulted right in front of them, and they left their post to protect the officer. And now you have to manage the need to react. So there's a human interaction there. So there's some level of compassion here, but also the professional responsibility of the person abandoning their post. And these are tough calls that prison management has to make. I know for the one with the suicide, if you need two people to open that door, why does the officer in the unit have the key? So eventually the key went to the backup team that would come, and that would help eliminate the impulse. But you have to ask yourself, am I doing anything to help stop that impulse or to help slow it down? Let's say slow it down. So that's a whole passage in itself, but it does reflect a little bit on this. So I got the next one, Joe, is leadership's role in designing fail-safes. So being in administration means you're not just responsible for policy, you're responsible for structure. You must see the operation as a system, not a set of individuals. And systems that work best are systems that absorb minor mistakes without collapsing, detect issues early, not just after damage is done, encourage reporting of problems or near misses, reward learning from error, not just punishing it, and support supervision with clear guidance, not just expectations. So you got to ask yourself, if an officer misses a step, what backup step exists? If a supervisor is distracted, who else can step in to verify? If two layers fail, does a third catch it, or do we crumble? Every critical process should have a backstop, not because staff are incompetent, but because they're human, and humans need systems that see them as such. You know, I've seen the creation of policy, Joe, and I love when they ask this question. If an officer misses a step, what backup steps exist? I see that question asked all the time in the tables that I'm involved in, because they know that's the initial implementation, let's say, for this policy in what we deal with. Obviously, there could be many departments have many different policies, but I'm relating this to the frontline effort. So officer, you could also equate it to front line. If you're head of medical, head of whatever it is, it's a front line, let's say in this case. If the officer misses a step, what backup step exists? And then if a supervisor is distracted, who else can step in to verify? And here is the chess move. If 2 layers fail, does a third catch it, or do we crumble? That's right. I said 6. I mean, do you have to go beyond 2? This is corrections. You got to go as far as you can go. Joe, what's your thoughts on that, especially as a leader? I mean, these are good questions.
Yeah, I mean, and you got to think about it. I don't want to say that we need to ensure that leadership, at the executive level or the administrative level needs to understand that they need to be connected to their people to understand what the processes are and what's happening on these shifts in these areas. When a mistake's made or when something happens or something's skipped, it should go through a multi-layer process. And sometimes it's not until it gets to somewhere out of the unit that it actually shows up, especially with uses of forces. Sometimes, things slip through the cracks and aren't done. And we don't see it because we do this so much every day. It becomes normal process. And then later on, somebody reviewing the use of force off the unit will point something out that we didn't see. So, it shouldn't be an endpoint to somebody who's in that layer to view the process and catch things that weren't done. It shouldn't just be a 2-layer person, and it shouldn't be a process that just crumbles after 2 failsafes are not caught. Sometimes it happens way later down the line that somebody sees something that points something out. So I don't think number one, leadership needs to be involved in the processes. They need to be involved with the staff, the supervision. They need to understand what's actually taking place on our unit. That's the most crucial thing. You find a lot of times that sometimes the leadership doesn't know what's taking place because it never makes it to the leadership. And that's where, we're not only failing ourselves, but we're failing the facility.
Joe, because that well said, Joe. That's true. That's 100% true, man. Because at the end of the day, if you're not putting those things in place, because again, you got that impossibility of perfection, then you are writing policies that are bound to fail because you haven't taken into account human error. And guys, when you're in leadership position, prison management, it's tactical. I get you got to understand the job, but you got to be able to manage people. So if you're not taking into account human error, shame on you, because this is all about people management business. Okay, let me get to the next one. So you got build a culture. Kind of discussed this a little bit, but it's still worth revisiting. Build a culture that encourages admission, not concealment. Some of the strongest moments in leadership come when staff admit unprompted, I missed something. But those moments only happen when the culture makes it safe to speak. A facility where staff feel safe to admit error is a facility that improves. That means leadership must respond to mistakes proportionately and respectfully. As I said, I always look at when it comes to that integrity and competency. I do. When it comes to a mistake, do I have an integrity concern? Because that's a lot different than a competency concern. A competency concern, I can look inwards. Can I do more? Can I train this person more? Integrity, that's more on the individual. Differentiate honest error from patterns of negligence. So again, it's patterns matter. Avoid gotcha leadership that uses paperwork as punishment, and model humility. Administrators should admit their own missteps when appropriate. When errors become a moment for growth instead of a moment for fear, your people stop hiding and your facility gets stronger. Do you agree with that, Joe? Correct? Is that how you led?
Yeah, pretty much. And unless it was, just a blatant violation that, an integrity issue or something that, could have defaced the safety and security of the institution. I have always encouraged my people, if they made a mistake, come to me and own it. Come to me with it before I find out about it. And if it's something that I feel is a teachable moment, then yeah, we're gonna do what we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'm not gonna go straight to paper with it. I've never was a lead by intimidation style supervisor, and I'm still not today. I wholeheartedly believe that every situation that happens, if it's a teachable moment, it needs to be a teachable moment. You get a better understanding from the person making a mistake. There's a better respect factor, and it doesn't diminish the person right off the bat. It doesn't stomp their soul into the ground. So I think, with that said, if my administrators came to me later on and say, hey, I heard this took place. Yep, I've already taken care of it. It's, to me, it was a teachable moment. I dealt with it. It's done. It's noted. We discussed about what we could have done better, and we drove on with it. That's something I always did.
Yeah, and you know what? I've had leadership I've worked with that demand such perfection from themselves, held themselves also to an impossible standard, that translated to the people that they supervised. It did. They unfortunately they pushed and pushed, and it wound up creating a culture that they weren't aware of, that really was a culture of fear, because you kind of held yourself to these impossible expectations, and you feel it. You feel the stress, and then you're pushing that stress and tension downwards, and now trying to get your people to reach an impossible expectation that you can't reach right now, but now you're in desperation mode. So now your staff become the scapegoat, and then when you don't reach that impossible expectation, you blame your staff. Yeah. Ain't that crazy when deep down inside it's the expectation you put on yourself? Yeah. All right, 2 more spots. So you got the difference between safety nets and excuses. None of this means you allow carelessness. Layered systems are not licensed for laziness. They're not excuses. They're not soft leadership. They are operational maturity. Failsafes protect the facility. They also protect good staff from being destroyed by a single lapse, especially in emotionally charged or chaotic situations. And at the same time, leadership must still hold the line. If someone repeatedly relies on the system to clean up their avoidable mistakes, that's not a flaw in the system. It's a failure of performance, and it should be addressed accordingly. And that's kind of what we discussed too before, Joe, about, is this individual concern? What layer did it stop at? Yeah. If it keeps on stopping at this one layer, I'm going after the individual. But if it keeps on making it past this bunch of layers, well, now we have a systematic concern. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, definitely. There's a huge difference between a safety net and an excuse, and it's spot on. If it's something that where the buck stops with the individual, we need to deal with it. If it's something that we find that's happening over and over and over, then obviously we've got a systemic issue, because we got all these fail safes and what we thought were checks and balances in place, but yet this is still happening. So we need to find out why. We need to determine why. And sometimes we find out it's not always about the individual. It's actually about the policy and things that we as leadership didn't include or didn't look at or didn't even think of.
Well said, Joe. Well said. Now we got the last part. This will be the last section to cover here, including the key insight, or kind of like a wrap up. So basically, I got the balance is everything. Systems review should be routine, not just post incident. Most systems are only evaluated after something goes wrong, and that's backwards. Administrators should regularly ask, where's the current system overly dependent on a single person's perfection? I love that. That's a great question to ask. Is this system, this part of the policy here, over relying on one person's perfection? What parts of our operations are most vulnerable to human fatigue or distraction? Are there enough cross-checks in place that allow us to catch a lapse early? And is our accountability system designed to correct or merely punish? Good systems evolve, and the best ones evolve before they fail. So the key insight here for this, and these are definitely good questions, Joe, but the key insight here is a correctional facility is not sustained by flawless staff. It's sustained by thoughtful systems that expect effort, not perfection, that catch the inevitable error, that guide people back into alignment without condemning them for being human. As administrators, our greatest duty isn't just to enforce rules. It's to build frameworks where people can do hard things well, recover when they falter, and know that the system around them is strong enough to carry the mission forward, mistakes and all. I love this part here, though. A correctional facility is not sustained by flawless staff. It's sustained by thoughtful systems that expect effort, not perfection. Joe, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's not just the correctional profession. It's pretty much any job, any profession you're into. Nothing is flawless. Sometimes we devise policies for policies for policies, and we find that we didn't account for a lot of things. That's why it's so integral that it's not just one person that's creating a policy. It should be a collaborative effort amongst a bunch, especially those that are living the process every day. Having their input when creating a policies, it's integral, because if you do it as an individual, you're going to find that you didn't account for a lot of things, especially if you're one of those that do not live the correctional life every day. If you're not involved in the processes with the people, there are going to be things that when you write policy, you're gonna not account for. Policies are, like you said, they're frameworks. They're just basic foundations for us to perform our job functions on a daily basis. It's just a basic framework. There's nothing that's 100% guaranteed, 100% foolproof. There never was, there never will be.
Yeah, and you know what's powerful here? Like, if I was creating policy, and I don't think me and Russ discussed this yesterday, but as I'm reading this thought, when you're part of the policy creators, and however, if you're writing them in isolation, which is wrong, or you're writing them on with a partnership, are you writing the policy to hold people accountable, or are you writing the policy to support them? I mean, that's a good question, because the first could be weaponizing the policy, and then basically you may not be realizing it, but the policy is being written hoping that they fail, because it's basically a policy written in an I gotcha moment. But if you write the policy where it shows support, I think that's what also brings investment from staff, because it would be great to know from leadership that this policy was created to help you. So yes, of course, there's a level of accountability here. That doesn't minimize, but this is a policy that was designed because we knew there was flaws, and we want to protect you because we believe that these flaws are, you're human. You're going to make mistakes. So how do we go ahead and build policies that support you, and not just meant to be build policies that weaponize? Does that make sense, Joe?
It does. And let me use your suicide scenario as an example. We actually devised a policy that supported the new individual in the event that staff was unable to get there. We don't want the officer entering the cells by themselves. Obviously, could be a setup, could be a trick. We want at least two people, if not more, going into the cell. But what we did do was add a clause in there to support the support that individual officer in the event that the inmate claims that he's going to commit suicide. He's got a bed sheet tied around his neck, but he's not tied off to another end. You could literally and justifiably use your chemical agents if he's actively claiming that he's going to commit suicide or acts like he's going to tie the other end off. You could actually use your chemical agents to subdue him and change his mindset. That will allow you to buy some extra time until the backup staff gets here and you can go in and get that inmate. Policies should always be written in support of the individual and not something that's going to hinder the individual or look for something to, kick them in the gut and keep them from doing their job.
Yeah, and I love when if after someone reviews the incident, the first thing they say is, "I need to see the policy. I need to see the policy." And it's like, maybe we should talk to the person first and see their perspective of the policy, if that makes sense. So before we start looking at the policy and seeing it from our perspective, which is far removed from what they went through, maybe we should have them educate us on what they thought of the policy and kind of see where there could be concerns. At least from their understanding.
And depending on how you write the policy, you could actually create concerns.
Yeah. That's true. Hey, Joe, you have anything you'd like to say in closing? It was a good dialogue.
Yeah, it was good dialogue. As far as policies and procedures go, they're a basic framework for us to do our jobs, our basic job functions by. And with that said, you're going to always have variables that pop up that aren't always in the scope of policies or procedures or post orders or whatever else comes along. Don't always fall back to the policies and procedures just because they're black and white. There's going to be a lot of variables that pop their head up during scenarios or situations that aren't in black and white. And sometimes the decisions that we make aren't right or wrong. It's just decisions that we made to scenarios that have never been discussed before or thought of when we created the policies. If you're the person that enhances policies or creates policies on the units, always get a collaborative effort from people outside of your scope, especially if you're not one that practices the job every day. Get that input, get that information from the people who live this every day, because they can offer you some sort of insight that never even crossed your mind. We should, and really my last thought is, we should always write policies and procedures that, first protect our staff, secondly, protect the inmate population, and, everything else we can kind of look at after the fact. Because again, when we devise policies or SOPs or, individually, sometimes they can be counterintuitive and counterproductive. Sometimes you can create a policy that creates more issues than what you have from the original scenario. So, make sure you're getting the input from your staff and some sort of collaborative effort, and get some good insight before you put something out.
Well said. And guys, again, I'm working on this book. It should be out probably within the next couple of days, at least the ebook. It's kind of formatted a little bit. Once I get the other thoughts, I think I have maybe about 11 or 12 more left to get in there and then do the closing and be done with it. I'm able to get more material out with the assistance of AI or ChatGPT, which is amazing. As I said, if you guys want to write a book, man, it will break it down for you. It'll ask you questions, and it just formulates a book based on your thoughts. I can even take the transcripts from the YouTube channels and put that in and create really good stories. I think this is a book. I mean, Joe's in prison leadership. Joe, this is a book you got to have in your office, because if anything, I mean, we just had an hour discussion on one passage. Yeah. There's 100 passages here. So look how much extra could be added to your training with just discussing certain sections or key sentences that stand out. As always, guys, the show is Teared Up. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.